Everyone. My name is Orsolya, but everyone just calls me Orshi for very obvious reasons, so we can just stick with that. And today I would like to talk to you about medieval diet in Edinburgh. So before I actually get to talking about Edinburgh, I also want to talk about my project a little bit and how this fits into the project. So I'm mainly researching during my PhD the dietary change in Scotland from the late Iron Age to the High Medieval period. And as part of this, Edinburgh is one of the major cities that I have been looking into. And of course, I have to preface this by saying that much of the material, actually all of the medieval material from Edinburgh, I received as a result of John's help. So big thank you to John for all of this, because this project couldn't have happened without his help. So let's talk about why I actually find royal boroughs quite so interesting. Well, the growth of the local population in these areas and then the intensifying mercantile activities that were both local and international altered the geographically well-situated areas of Scotland into places of social interactions and social transformations as well. And there were secular and ecclesiastical identities, people from different social backgrounds and origins that occupy these centres. And the largest borough cities actually happened to arise along the east coast of medieval Scotland, and they amassed a significant trading and trading surplus wealth through the centuries of the first half of the millennium, as they had easy access to sea routes, and this was obviously a crucial factor in their development as well, not only economically, but as socially as well. So, there we go. So before we begin to talk about the project and my findings, I have to talk to you about diet. And I would like to ask whether you think diet is important. But I probably shouldn't just leave you in suspense. Diet is very important. And food is a really complex subject, and it's part of our lives. It's associated with not only our general nutrition and biology, but it informs of economics, international politics, religion, and belief. And all of this influences things like preparation and consumption of various food types. And the structures of diet and cuisine are shaped by these various cultural systems. Food is therefore not only a biological necessity, but it is, of course, a biological necessity. We all need to eat to actually live, but it is also a cultural commodity. So archaeology of food is very interesting because food is a vital component for life. And also a key factor of social life. So what you eat, how you procure it, how you prepare it, and even how you dispose of your food will be reflecting your identity and your position in society as well. So our dietary preferences essentially are very much tied to our own cultural backgrounds. So then why study medieval cities from a dietary perspective? Well, we do have a lot of historical evidence available about these medieval borough centres, for example, and some even touch upon things like food, but these are really quite biased. They don't tend to write down the everyday shopping trips to the market of the regular people, but they largely focus on the elite. And we don't really get this everyday detail of various food practices. And of course, this is the time, medieval period is the time of the rise of the first cities and the creation of these new social spaces and zones of interactions. And this then influences the people of the borough. So there's various differences in social status and wealth, and these people interact with one another. There's different people in these areas from different social backgrounds. There's new trade horizons developing between different European countries, but also locally, and different trade focuses as well in different cities. Now, of course, we have ecclesiastical and lay communities that are essentially living in the same sort of space, sharing this space with one another and influencing one another. And so can we actually see medieval cities as social and dietary melting pots was my main question when I started my research. So before I actually go into it any further, I feel I should talk a little bit about isotope research, get into the science so I don't just bombard you with pretty data points that I find pretty, but you might not. So to learn about how this research works, we basically look at a protein called collagen, which we can extract from bones, and dentine, which is the inner part or the organic part of your teeth. The food and the water that we consume during life will be incorporated into our bodily tissues, and they leave these certain signatures, which are called isotopic signatures. Now, these specific signatures can be detected in bones and teeth, and even hair and fingernails. This then helps archaeologists to identify the main types of food that one eats. So the water they drink and even where they live or grew up will be reflected in their body. So this technique can be used to study the people of the past, and through chemical analysis of bones and teeth, we can find through the archaeological record various information about how people lived in the past. So isotopes are essentially different forms of the same chemical element, and some isotopes like carbon and nitrogen are useful in helping us reconstruct what the main components of past diet was like. And we could differentiate between, for example, terrestrial and marine sources of diet, or even the consumption of C3 or C4 plants. C4 plants being things like maize and various tropical grasses, and C3 plants more temperate are from more temperate regions. So this can then give us a general picture of an individual's diet over time. And basically, this is the kind of thing that we end up with. So this image here depicts a typical food web. And this is what you will be seeing through my graphs, just not with nice pictures like this. So essentially what you would expect to see in a general food web is for your herbivore species being quite depleted in carbon and nitrogen because they are in a low position on the food chain. Now, your omnivores will be slightly higher because they do consume some higher protein food stuff, and then your carnivores will be even more elevated in terms of nitrogen. Now, then you will have carbon increase with marine foodstuff, with the consumption of marine foodstuff, as well as C4 plants. Now, we are not really going to be thinking about C4 plants today, so we will be focusing on the marine food web. The marine food web is much lengthier than terrestrial food web is. So what you will essentially find is that the marine animals tend to be more elevated in nitrogen, but also in carbon because their source of carbon is different than for terrestrial organisms. So you will see marine fish highly elevated in nitrogen as well as carbon, and seals in particular, they are on the top of the food chain, for example, in marine food web. So they will be extremely high, both in carbon 13 and nitrogen 15. Okay, so let's actually talk about medieval Edinburgh now. So before I set out to analyze my samples, I of course have to collect my samples, learn a lot about the different sites that I will be analyzing, and then do my lab work. We will not really talk about this part, but this actually happens to be the Edinburgh material that I was studying. But let's focus on Edinburgh. So along with many other cities, including Aberdeen and Perth, Edinburgh became a royal borough established by David I in the 12th century. And the political climate greatly influenced the advancement of the city. And it was initially a small settlement, but of course it developed further. And as Leith was granted to Edinburgh in 1329, the harbour became part of the city, and it became to rule international trade by the 15th century AD, and the development of the borough was closely tied to the emerging ecclesiastical and monastic centres as well, starting with the Augustinian community of Holyrood, who developed Canongate. So today I will be focusing on three particular sites, which is St. Giles Cathedral, and I will talk about an earlier and later population from St. Giles, Holyrood Abbey, as well as Constitution Street. So we know St. Giles Cathedral is located in the heart of Edinburgh and has been the parish kirk of the city from the 12th century onwards. Now, as the parish church of Edinburgh, it was a really popular burial ground, and while those of wealth and authority sought to be buried within the kirk itself, the surrounding cemetery was available for the wider population. In the 1980s, there was an excavation undertaken at the site due to construction works. The excavation was conducted around the south choir aisle and yielded extensive skeletal remains, which have been broadly chronologically categorized to from the 12th century onwards to post-Reformation. So there were changes in the burial practices noted, with an increasing number of coffins through time, and the graves of the later periods are largely actually considered to be of elite status. So although the ratio of sexes was approximately even, the female remains dominated the later periods, because this particular area belonged to St. Anne's Isle, which was dominated by females again, who was the patron saint of seamstresses. And the phasing of these particular graves actually provided an amazing opportunity to study the dietary change in relation to the same site, but with changing status through time. So the next site is from Holyrood Abbey. In 1995, a small archaeological excavation was funded by Historic Scotland and was undertaken here. 33 skeletal remains were unearthed from the medieval cemetery and were suggested to date to the 14th and 15th centuries. The excavation during this time period found that this had to be the parish cemetery of Canongate and not actually the elite population of Holyrood, and they were part of this urban assemblage. So then finally, Leith Constitution Street. Now Constitution Street lies near the docks of Leithsport and was constructed with the purpose to ease the connection between the city and the harbour in 1790. And it cut through the graveyard of the former kirk of Our Lady St. Mary, which is now known as the parish church. As a result of this construction of the trams tracks, Headland Archaeology conducted an excavation here in 2009 and unearthed numerous remains, 305 articulated skeletons. Many of them were radiocarbon dated. Some of them even were subjected to mobility isotope studies, and there were a few individuals that were identified as newcomers to the area. So while the majority of the individuals are likely from the 16th and 17th century, there are a few skeletons which may belong to the earlier 15th century hospital from the area. Okay, so let's go on to my findings. So before I actually study the human population, I have to look at the local fauna, because we have to compare the human diet to the faunal diet to be able to actually interpret it better. So what you see here is the medieval faunal remains from Edinburgh, and you can see the herbivores being located in this area, again being more depleted in nitrogen and carbon, and we have our omnivorous animals, the dogs and pigs and chicken. Chicken tends to have actually quite similar diets to these animals. And we have our marine food web over here. There was actually, interestingly, an anglerfish present in one of these bags that I have gone through to try and find some medieval fauna remains, which was a really interesting find. And actually, this really seems to fit with the interpretation. So that was very interesting for me. So let's talk about the humans. So this is the earlier phase of St. Giles that you can see here. And interestingly, there seems to be a connection. The majority of the male individuals seem to have more depleted carbon and nitrogen values than the females. They seem to be consuming more marine foodstuff than the males do during this time period, with the exception of these two individuals. And there's this one male individual who clearly doesn't necessarily consume any marine foodstuff during his life. Now, we are looking at bone collagen, so this means that this is an averaged long-term diet of someone's last decade or so. But it seems that there's no significant marine consumption in his diet. These individuals are, although quite similar to these omnivorous animals, but they have more elevated carbon values, which indicates that they do consume some marine foodstuff, but not as much as these individuals here. So in the following set, what we see is from the 14th and 16th century, every single individual, with the exception of this one female, consumes a lot of marine foodstuff. There's a greater reliance on marine food sources in the later phases. And if we cross-compare these two sets of data, we can see that the majority of the females actually tends to favor marine food sources to the male individuals buried at St. Giles Cathedral. When we compare this is the more higher class individuals that we see here, and when we compare Holyrood Abbey, which is an urban cemetery from the 14th to 16th century, we see, first of all, we see some variability here, but out of 9 individuals that were analyzed, the majority of them fit into this lower end of things. So they do seem to consume some marine foodstuff, but very little. And there's these 2 individuals who similarly to this one male from St. Giles, do not seem to consume any sort of marine foodstuff. And there's this one male who seem to have relied a lot on marine fish, which is quite interesting. Now, when we compare to these sites, Constitution Street, we see a great amount of variability at this particular site. So again, when we compare the different time periods, of course, the majority of these individuals is likely from the 16th, 17th centuries. And there doesn't seem to be a connection between sexes, so there's no differentiation. There's a lot of male individuals that do not consume as much marine foodstuff as well as females. So there's no such differentiation at this particular site like we saw at St. Giles Cathedral. But there are some very interesting individuals here present who are quite different from the other groups. Just to see this more in detail. Now, what I would like to point out that this seems to represent a multimodal distribution of diet within medieval Edinburgh. So we see a group who seem to rely quite heavily on the consumption of various marine food sources, while there's a group who, while would have consumed some level of marine foodstuff, they weren't as reliant on them as this other group. There's also a third group who have extremely depleted carbon values, which is indicative of a diet that is reliant on terrestrial foodstuff largely. Now, of course, then we can go into the identification of certain individuals within this wider data set. So, for example, the most depleted carbon and nitrogen values come from this particular individual from Constitution Street. This is skeleton 478, a female, who actually has been subjected to strontium and oxygen isotope analysis before as part of the Leith's Past Lives project, and has been identified as someone who grew up elsewhere and not in Edinburgh. Now, based on the interpretation of that particular study, it is very possible that this individual would have come from as close as Musselburgh or Fife, but of course we cannot really say that she wouldn't have come from farther afar. And the most elevated values also come from Leith Constitution Street. So you can see this increasing variability through time and in between the different sites. When it comes to St. Giles Cathedral, what we do find that there's this one individual, a female from the later phase, from the 14th to 16th century phases of the site, who is the only individual from this particular set of skeletons that reflects this more reliance, a lower reliance on marine food sources. This is interesting because this particular skeleton has been identified as having various skeletal pathologies and possibly tuberculosis as well. So she did not only differ from this particular population from a dietary perspective, but from an osteological perspective as well. And this particular male also differs increasingly from this population. So it would be interesting to see whether this person would have come from elsewhere and has been buried in Edinburgh and relied on an entirely different diet, but also grew up in a different region. So before I finalize my thoughts, I actually wanted to talk about sulfur isotopes because I also managed to conduct sulfur isotope analysis on these individuals thanks to the new methods at SWERC. So sulfur is quite a complex isotope and it can tell us about diet. It can help us identify freshwater food sources from marine food sources. But when we are in an area that is closely located near the shore, that will be likely affected by the so-called sea spray effect. And because of this, we will see high elevated sulfur values, which can be really useful, and it can actually tell us about location instead of diet. And this is what I was trying to utilize, because obviously all these medieval centers that I was looking at, they're all located on the coast, so they would all be influenced by the sea spray effect. And what I expected to see was where these really high elevated sulfur values that kind of seem almost marine. And from the non-local individuals who would have been newcomers to the area, I would have seen more depleted values. So this is what I found at Edinburgh, a great amount of variability. Now, of course, here I also analyzed the faunal remains. And interestingly, the herbivores seem to have really elevated sulfur values, which is likely related to various foddering techniques and grazing areas, while the omnivores still have elevated values. Essentially anything above 10 per mil here that you can see counts as a marine signal or influenced by a marine signal. And as you can see, the majority of the humans are quite similar in terms of sulfur to these omnivorous creatures, regardless of their carbon values, so regardless of how much marine foodstuff they have consumed. However, this is fairly variable, with all the Holyrood individuals being fairly high up, so clearly differentiating between different regions. And we can see several individuals who are way below this local average. And what this means is that these individuals were likely new to the area of Edinburgh. And if we connect this with the diet, we actually can see some interesting things. So this particular individual was actually quite depleted in carbon and nitrogen, so didn't really consume too much marine foodstuff, and seems to have the lowest sulfur values, which means that he would have come from a more inland location and not from the coast. So clearly not a person from Edinburgh. Now from Constitution Street, we see an elderly male with some health issues who also had depleted sulfur values, clearly came from a different area. And interestingly, the female individual that was identified as having grown up in a different region by a previous study from Constitution Street is also identified as a newcomer. So she differed in her diet, she differed in her origins, but also she was actually clearly relatively new, even in later in her life, to the area of Edinburgh. So just to finalize what I want to say about what I have found. Well, medieval Edinburgh was a very complex place, not only from a social perspective, but a dietary perspective. Different sites from the medieval city reflect very different things. And we can see differences occurring with social status depending on the site we are at, with different sexes. And also we can see differences through time, which is really intriguing. Now, there's clearly this variability in marine fish consumption, which again is sociocultural as well as diachronic. And we can start and identify not only population level trends here, but access these individual life histories, which are particularly interesting. Of course, it's very time consuming. There's a lot of individuals that we have to study. And I think it's extremely important to point out how we need to work together with different disciplines and bring in all sorts of evidence to be able to access these life histories, as well as to be able to better understand these population level trends. Now, there's a lot of future work that will happen, hopefully. We need to collect wider baselines. We need a lot more fish to actually be able to identify what kinds of fish were consumed and their popularity, where they were fished, etc. We need to compare these medieval urban data to more rural settlements. Of course, it's a bit more problematic because we have less development at rural areas, therefore fewer skeletons. And we need to do some more incremental dentinal analysis, which is something I have done at Aberdeen, to access long-term diachronic changes from the same individual when it comes to diet. And finally, we need more nuanced chronologies to better understand these changes through time and in between different sites. So I have a lot of people to thank for this work. I can't even list them all, but first and foremost right now, thank you, John, for letting me access this material. It has been an amazing research and I hope you found it interesting. So thank you.